throughout the countries.
Thank you very much, Helen. We're next going to talk about, to the best, I think we're going to do this anyway, engaging and mobilising the media for nutrition. Yeah, okay. And Eneya Phiri from Zambia Civil Society.
Thank you, Tom. So we had a very invigorating, very energetic session on engaging the media, and I believe it's to be expected when you have so many journalists in one room. So it was really, really interactive, and several issues just came out. How do we engage with the media and mobilize the media for nutrition? And how do we use the media as a conduit through which we can raise nutrition at a policy level, to decision makers? But also, how do we engage with the media to raise awareness and create demand at community level? So very many insightful, feedback came from the journalists, and it was a very, very exciting session. Now, with particular regards to specific progress that was being made, there was a lot that was spoken about investing time, investing resources into the media and engaging with the media and building trusting relationships with media personnel. So we heard from Burkina Faso how, for example, they steadily and slowly built a network of journalists and institutionalized this network of journalists throughout the specific ministries and working with communications departments in the specific ministries that identified several journalists who are now nutrition champions and reporting regularly on nutrition issues, advancing the nutrition dialogue throughout the country, which I thought was fantastic. We got also from Bangladesh, who have put together a handbook for journalists, so an issue of training was very important. Journalists a key through which we have this nutrition dialogue sustained and communicated. The narrative on nutrition is really sustained and used through the journalists, and they need to know exactly what they're talking about. One guy was really passionate and say, don't talk to me about stunting. What is stunting? How do I report stunting, for instance? How do I make it newsworthy? So make me understand. So very good lessons coming out of Bangladesh, who put together a small handbook that journalists could just pick up and clearly have the information that they require when it comes to reporting on some of these issues. Also, we heard from Uganda, a very spirited contribution from Uganda, who've invested time in bringing journalists out to the major cities and in rural communities. In a sense, just really bringing the story to the journalists so that as they report on these issues, they have a personal feel, personal touch on who is actually impacted by, by malnutrition. If they actually see these stories for themselves, it makes for richer reporting, it makes for more accurate spreading of the message and creating of the dialogue. But also, we did recognize a few challenges. Nutrition is still not a political issue. Very many journalists in the room were saying it's quite easy to report on political things. There's something political is happening. I know it's very common in my country, screaming headlines about political differences between political parties. But how do we make nutrition just as an interesting topic, engaging specifically with journalists? And a huge concern came out from the journalists saying nutrition is not very political yet. It's still a very rather boring topic to report on. It's not very interesting. So how do we jazz it up a little bit, and how do we repackage nutrition so that it becomes more and more interesting to report on for journalists, which I thought was fantastic coming out of some of those reflections from the journalists themselves. But also, we need to support the media with empirical evidence to demonstrate how nutrition impacts our families, how it impacts households, but most importantly, how it impacts the economy. And I think this ties back to the political theme. Once we start to understand and recognize through that nutrition has an impact, not just personally on people's homes, but also on the impact on the economy, and also an impact on the political strength of the country, I think then it becomes a very interesting topic to report on. Then it becomes something that journalists can grab on. And something that came out really as a challenge is journalists we should not chase journalists with information. Journalists should chase us, with information on nutrition issues. And this really speaks back to the jazzing up of nutrition. How do we make it more interesting, more enticing? And I remember during that session, a personal anecdote that struck me was a personal relationship I had with one of the journalists back at home in my country, whom I think at the time we were trying to engage with them, and maybe they didn't understand the issues on nutrition. And after a while, they came back to me and said, look, after having been trained, now I understand some of these issues. I must confess that initially I had saved you in my phone as not again. So every time I called this journalist on nutrition issues, he looked at his phone and it was not again. So how do we jazz up the story of nutrition? How do we make it more interesting so we are not the not agains in this journalists' phones. So I thought that was really interesting coming out of the session. But also, we need to understand what motivates journalists and acknowledge the challenges that they face in balancing the importance of the issue with the incentives that drives their work and, the balance of their work. Because at the end of the day, journalists need to make money. I mean, there's newspapers they need to sell papers for them to remain afloat, for instance. But how do they continue to, generate an income and report on nutrition issues and spread the message on nutrition? So we need to be able to just really find that dynamic and just create that balance when engaging with journalists, which I thought was fantastic. But as far as next steps, and there's some good news, together we can make 2016 the year. Our media work on nutrition operates on a different level. How do we engage with the journalists so that they can understand? How do we subtract the jargon? How do we make journalists understand as they spread this message about stunting without using all these highly technical nutrition terms, so that they can get on the bandwagon also and begin to report on some of these issues more effectively and efficiently? And also, how do we forge new relationships and sustain new relationships with journalists? Because at the end of the day, remember, it's through the media that the narrative on nutrition is sustained and is progressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I think